Hi, everybody. Right now, I have Nick Caros in the hot seat.
Hey, John.
Nick's been here for just about as long as I have, so we've got a lot of research to cover. But if you want to just give us a brief introduction, then we'll get into the weeds.
Yeah, sure. My name's Nick Caros. I'm a fourth-year PhD student at the MIT Transit Lab. I'm originally from Vancouver, Canada, and I've mostly been working with the MBTA and Washington Metro.
Very cool. So, what research have you been doing over the years? Give us an overview.
I've been involved in a few different things. My journey through the PhD has had some twists and turns, but I initially started out working on performance and ridership visualization dashboards for transit agencies, and then the pandemic hit as I was about 5 months into my PhD, and I saw that as an opportunity to work on some research that nobody had done before. So I pivoted, and now my dissertation is focused mostly on how remote work is affecting the demand for travel and travel behavior, and then also what we could potentially do about it in order to be able to meet the needs of the people who are doing remote work and others.
So, I have a natural follow-up question.
Sure.
How is remote work affecting travel demand patterns?
Well, it's arguably the biggest shift in demand patterns, travel demand patterns, that is, over a generation or two. Now you're seeing in the U.S. and especially in big cities, somewhere in the 30 to 40% of all worked days are taking place either at home or at a place that's not the typical employer's business premises. So that's enormous, right? You can imagine peak hour travel, rush hour traffic is just way down. Transit agencies have really seen a huge hit there as well. So their ridership in major U.S. cities can be off by 30 or 40% compared to what it was before the pandemic. So this is creating huge challenges from a revenue perspective, but that's not to say people aren't going anywhere and they're just sitting at home all day. They're often using this remote work as a chance to go and run errands at lunchtime, or to go and actually do that remote work at somewhere that might not be the home, whether that's a cafe or a library or a local co-working space. So the demand for travel is still there. It's just not necessarily happening at the same times or to the same locations that it was before.
So, if travel is not as heavy in the peak then, but we're seeing more travel at other times of the day, what does that mean for kind of the traditional way that we plan transportation? Because we usually plan around the peaks, right? Is there an opportunity now to change that? Like, what do you see?
Yeah, I think there really is. And I think that's actually a good thing both for remote workers, but also for everybody else who doesn't necessarily travel during what are traditional commuting times, which is a huge segment of the population. And as you said, typically we've kind of designed and operated transportation systems in order primarily to meet that peak demand of going into the city or into employment centers during the morning and then coming back out to residential areas in the evening. But there's all kinds of people who have non-traditional work schedules, people who may not be working, students, seniors, who still need to get around, and often the focus of the transit agencies or the highway departments was not on making those trips as convenient as possible. So I think by taking advantage of the fact that these peak hours are not necessarily as intense as they used to be, and shifting hopefully some resources to the rest of the day, but also to other parts of the week, right? We're actually seeing a lot of transit demand on the weekends now. It's recovered often more than the weekday ridership has recovered. And that's because people are still interested in using public transit to go and do leisure activities or cultural activities on the weekends. And so by shifting some of those resources away from the kind of commuting class towards the rest of the times of day and to the destinations that other people are using, hopefully you can make public transport and transportation more generally better for everybody.
So, given what you've been saying, there's some challenges like the revenue streams, for example, but also some opportunities in the way that people are traveling that can maybe make our transit a little better. If you were just in charge of the world, but specifically mostly in charge of the transit agency, and you could make people work remotely more than they currently are or less than they currently are, what would you want people to do?
That's a good question. I mean, a lot of my research has been looking at surveys of what people are doing, and what I actually have found is that preferences vary quite a bit depending on people's life circumstances, their home, what amenities they have in their home, what kind of job they do, of course. And so I would not pretend to be able to tell people what's best for them overall. Generally, I think, of course, limiting the demand for transportation, especially during those peak hours, is broadly speaking, good for the environment, especially for people who are driving alone and poor, not so fuel efficient vehicles. Having those people work remotely is probably better for the environment, for air pollution, for a lot of things, but only if those circumstances work for them. But I think also entirely working remotely is not necessarily a wonderful thing for society either. I think there's a lot of spontaneous interactions that happen when people are in the same room as each other that are really hard to replicate using Zoom and other technology. And then just, there's the retail businesses and people whose livelihoods depend on being able to serve others. And I think some of that ultimately could be shifted to more like neighborhood-based retail rather than downtown retail. So I think in the long run, the best option is probably for some mix of the two. People can have the flexibility to do remote work when they would like to and when it works for them, but also be able to go and interact with their colleagues and the rest of society, and get out and meet other people when on occasion as well. And I think that's actually where you're seeing things going these days. A lot of companies are moving towards more of a hybrid schedule if they're the kind of companies that could do any remote work at all. For exactly that reason, that there's benefits to both, and so why not let people mix and match depending on what works for them.
Very interesting. So we've talked a lot about the transportation side, but one of the things that we learn all the time as transportation planners is that transportation and land use planning are really intimately linked. Yeah. So are there also implications from your research about the way that land use should change, or even just the way that, like, if we know that transportation is going to change in some way, we should also change the land use to reflect the changes in the transportation?
Yeah, great question. We've been doing some interesting research using Chicago as a case study and looking at how people are now moving around the city in order to do their work trips. And people talk about remote work. They often use the sort of synonym of working from home. But what we're seeing is that people aren't actually working from home all the time when they're doing remote work. They're working, like I said, in coffee shops and libraries and co-working spaces. And oftentimes those are also concentrated in the same places where the traditional workplace would have been, the downtown core or perhaps some sort of sub-centers of the city. And they're not really well spread out across the city. So we're seeing that people are actually traveling just about as far for these discretionary remote work trips to go work at a cafe or a co-working space as they would if they were going into the office. And because there's not often those land uses mixed into residential communities. So one thing that I'll be recommending in my dissertation, to give you a sneak preview, is that we distribute some of those third places or community spaces for remote work into these residential neighborhoods, and especially ones that don't have a lot of current amenities. Those are the places where we're seeing people having to travel the furthest, and of course those are often the communities, low-income communities and places that have suffered from a lack of investment anyways. So I think there's some opportunities, especially for the public sector to step in and perhaps create community centers or libraries that are more geared towards allowing people to do remote work, so that everyone in the community can take advantage of the ability to do remote work, not necessarily at their home.
That's really interesting. So it sounds like then that you see a lot of opportunities now, and just because there's all these changes in society, right, we can start to address some of these fundamental things like underserved communities, for example, with this as being an additional springboard to kind of launch into that kind of action. Is that right? Yeah,
that's exactly right. I mean, the interesting thing about doing this research now is that the travel patterns have changed, but of course infrastructure, land use, transportation systems take a long time to adjust.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing the behavior change, but not really the societal shifts and the investment, especially from the public sector, that haven't really caught up to what is actually changing in society. And even in the private sector too, I think there's a lot of opportunities for kind of like creative new transportation services to serve remote workers, for example, or even more private investment in flexible co-working spaces and stuff like that. That would better serve everybody who's doing remote work. But unfortunately, those things take a little while to get off the ground. And so I think there's still a really big gap between the kind of services that are available to remote workers and the amount of people who are actually doing remote work.
Very interesting. Do you think that these trends will continue even if the transportation doesn't catch up to the behavioral trends that we're seeing?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Of course, these things feed back into one another. So I think there's a lot of demand for remote work right now, but unfortunately, if the transportation systems aren't able to serve those remote workers well, then perhaps people will decide not to do it as much, or vice versa. If we can expand our transportation services to really respond to the travel demand patterns that we're seeing for remote work, maybe more people will be inclined to get out there and do remote work from places that are not their home, or to go into the office. So yeah, there's a lot of feedback between the two, and it's hard to tell exactly what the demand levels are right now, because of course they're a function of the service quality of the transportation system.
Very interesting. One last question kind of on this area before we move on to some fun stuff. Not that this isn't fun, but
depends who you ask.
Depends who you ask, yeah. I'm just curious, from literature that you've read and case studies that you've done, and just the news that we have about this, the return to work and future of work, are there any really innovative policies that you've seen come out of cities or transit agencies, things that you might think are kind of a model to emulate?
That's a good question. Yeah, so we have seen, like I mentioned, one thing that I think would be really beneficial is for the public sector to either fund or subsidize community workspaces for people who want to do remote work but maybe can't do so at the home because of poor internet quality or lack of home office or available space. And there have been some jurisdictions in Florida and in Maine that I'm aware of, although probably others by now, that have started to do that, have offered funding or subsidies for co-working spaces that cater to people with a lower income so that they can come in there and work. And I think that's a really great initiative. The interesting thing about this, honestly, the whole kind of sphere of remote work, is that governments are often taking really opposite tacks. There's really no best solution right now. And I think that's because of a lack of really comprehensive research going on. But you see some governments are, like the government of Ireland, for example, that's encouraging people to do remote work from rural locations as a way of sort of boosting the economic vibrancy of rural locations. But then you have the mayor of New York, browbeating companies who are letting their employees work from home. And of course, those are two completely different jurisdictions. But I think, you see this huge divergence in approaches to public policy. Public officials don't know whether to encourage remote work, whether to discourage remote work. Often it seems to come down to a lot of kind of personal or anecdotal opinions about what should be done rather than evidence-based research, because the widespread remote work, at the very least, has only been around for a couple of years. So I think there's room for a lot more research here, and hopefully that will help inform policy in the future.
Very cool. Well, thank you for sharing all those insights. That's some really interesting research. Can't wait to hear anything else you are able to figure out on that before we lose you to the real world. Yeah. But very, very cool to hear about that.
Thanks.
So I'm going to completely hack away at the serious level of this conversation now.
Okay.
You have a cat in your family.
I do. Yep.
And her name is Mika, for the audience, in case anybody's wondering. Yeah. What are Mika's thoughts on remote work? Does she prefer that people work remotely or not? What are your
Yes, as a creature who's completely emotionally dependent on me and my fiance Nikki, she loves remote work. She loves when we both do remote work at the same time. She'll sit in the middle of the room. We kind of work remotely in both corners of our living room, and she'll sit right in the middle so she can keep an eye on both of us and what we're doing. And she gets quite sad when anybody decides to leave for the day. So another benefit of remote work is that your animals get more attention.
And now we also know what policy choices will be made once the cats are in charge. Keep that in mind.
Yeah.
So another question. You recently spent quite a long time in Paris.
That's right.
On your internship with the OECD.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any cool takeaways from that? Either the experience, the internship there, or just living in Paris? Things you want the world to know?
I mean, living in Paris is wonderful. The food, this is not an original opinion, is amazing. And, being able to just go to a little boulangerie on my way to work in the morning. Really loved the food, the lifestyle. The transit system is great, as most people know. I haven't had the fortune of being able to visit a lot of the big Asian cities where transit is also very well organized. So Paris was probably sort of the best system that I've ever encountered. And one thing that I thought was really fascinating, and just kind of a no-brainer from a transit operations perspective, is that you could sign up to link your transit card to your bank account, and then you would just tap it every time you use the transit system, and you would get billed at the end of the month depending on how much you used.
Oh, interesting.
Which is normal practice for a lot of sort of industries and stuff where you're using something repeatedly. And they would also look at whether or not you exceeded any of the discounted fares. So like if you used in one of the weeks of the month, if you used it more than your weekly pass would have cost you, then they cap the fare at that rate. And if you use it more than a monthly pass would have cost you, you get it capped at that rate. And you can also use it for the bike share system.
Wow.
So you basically have this one little card in your wallet, and it basically is like a license to get around the city without having to think about, oh, do I have to load my card? Do I have enough money on my card? It's just linked to your bank account. The processing happens automatically. Don't even have to think about it. So I really like that approach. But yeah, I mean, Paris was so great that I'm planning to move back there after I graduate.
That's incredible. Glad you found such a nice place. We'll get there someday.
Yeah, would love to have you visit.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Nick, for sitting for this interview. Really enjoyed hearing all about your research.
Yeah, great to hang out with you, John. Thanks.
All right.